That's the demand side. Got to do the supply side. It's my last one. Guns for slaves. I'm going to do this real quick, although this is the hardest one. I want to know if there's any evidence that more European gunpowder exports to Africa caused or produced more slaves. Okay. I want to know if there's any evidence that Africans captured and exported more slaves in order to buy more guns. Okay, it's a cycle. When you read the literature, on the African side, it's slaves for guns. No, then the rulers say, no, we're not capturing slaves to exchange for European goods. We would never do that. You know, but if I conquer you, hey, everything you have, I own. Isn't that the way it's done in Europe? You know? But there is some evidence that the Homie is the main one, that slaves were captured there so that the Homie could arm up and then expand and conquer a lot of other coastal nations. This one here we get from the European side, that that gunpowder is being shipped in. It's important to the trade. We need guns. During the 7 Years' War, British slavers were able to successfully petition the Crown for exemptions against the restriction of gunpowder exports because it was so important to the African slave trade. Okay, and many other bits of evidence that there's a relationship there. I want to know if there's an impact on production because I want to get into that black box. And that's a little harder to do. These are just some measures. Here's the correlation between slave exports and gunpowder. Pretty correlated. You can see, I mean, it's almost the same, to tell you the truth. Roger Ransom saw that and said that that's the point. That's the case. But it's not really the case because slaves are also exchanged. Gunpowder is also exchanged for slaves. And it could be the case that behind this, investment's moving around too, and that's why you see the correlation. Here is guns and gunpowder. Here's what I'm going after. David Eltis thinks that, well, Warren, you can't do this guns for slaves thing because if you look at the share of gunpowder in exports, it declines in the later years. And so it's not important. It's becoming less important in the commodity bundle shipped to Africa. And I say, yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. But that's not what I'm getting at. I don't want to get at the exchange of gunpowder for slaves. I want to get at the use of gunpowder to produce slaves. Okay? And this is a better proxy for that. Okay? The pounds of gunpowder per slave exported. So the pounds of cotton per slave exported is increasing too, but cotton is not used to produce slaves. Gunpowder is used to produce slaves. Okay? And this strongly suggests that something's happening with gunpowder. Increases over time pretty dramatically. Okay? So this is how I do it. I estimate the supply and demand function, and what I want to do is identify and estimate these things here. This is gunpowder exports to Africa, gunpowder imports into Africa. This is the supply function of price, that positively sloped supply function that we identified earlier. The gunpowder is going to shift that curve around. Okay? Here's the contemporaneous one. Okay? Increased gunpowder today, increased slaves today. Shifts it out. Here's the lag one. Increased gunpowder in the past, increased slaves today. Now we know that that's clearly guns for slaves. Right? This one could be guns for slaves, could not be guns for slaves because it could be exchanged for the slaves. But the fact that it takes a year for that circuit to complete sort of eliminates that as a slaves for guns hypothesis, because ship would have to leave England, go to Africa, get some slaves, get back to England, and then influence the number of guns and the amount of gunpowder put on the ships to go to Africa. Pretty remote. So if this is positive, it's also evidence of guns for slaves. This one here, if this one's positive, then it's saying that the slaves are coming out here. Next year, the guns are coming in. Okay? That's clearly a slaves for guns issue. Slaves are coming out this year. Next year, more guns come in. Okay? So that's how I interpret these things. Slaves for guns here, guns for slaves here. Okay, now what I have to do is set this, oh, and here's the demand. This is where I control for the investment, the working capital sent to Africa. We got price here, and then we got wars shifting things around. And XT is other things, like the price of gunpowder. I sometimes am able to get that. So I put in as many other controls as I can. So we set supply equal to demand. We solve for price. Estimate the price as a function of the exogenous variables. Get that first stage estimate of price and plug it back into this equation. Okay? And then estimate, we want to go after this one. And then estimate that supply function. Okay? And that's what we do here. Now, oh, and this is an issue, an econometric issue. I'm going to have to instrument gunpowder here because there could be correlations between gunpowder in here and price. Okay, so there could be some correlation there. I want to get some more exogeneity in gunpowder, and I instrument gunpowder using wars. Wars really, and I'll show you that equation pretty quickly. Okay, so here's the first stage where we estimate the price, predict the price, XBP, put it back into the supply function. XBP is that estimated first stage price. Okay, comes out positive, significant, just like you would expect in the supply function. Here are those gunpowder variables. This is the one that's forwarded, T+1. If that's positive, then it's a slaves for guns type thing. Don't get that. No slaves for guns. We do get strong evidence of guns for slaves. Okay? Now we have to instrument these things. We have to do a little more. And here's the instrumental estimation of the gunpowder as a function of wars. Wars shift around the amount of gunpowder that can be exported. It did not, these wars did not influence the price equation. Okay, so these are good instruments, and they satisfy the exclusion condition. And you can see how the Napoleonic War reduced the gunpowder. Of course, they needed it to fight Napoleon. The American Revolution reduced the amount of gunpowder sent to Africa. Of course, they needed it to fight those unruly colonists. And the 7 Years' War, they got the exemption. There's a great book on that that sort of explains why that doesn't come through. Okay? So that's the instrument for gunpowder. And then we take the predicted gunpowder here and plug it back into that supply equation. And that's these here. And what we get is the positive one, the contemporaneous one, and pretty high T statistic on the lag one, nothing on the forward. So I take this to be pretty strong evidence. Oh, I think I do one more thing. Here I do a falsification test where I put British cottons in the supply function to see if that functions just like the gunpowder, and it does not. Nothing from cotton. So I'm pretty confident that I've identified the supply function and that guns for slaves is a serious structural relationship between British trade and the African slave exports. Okay? Now, if I do it for the post-1756 period, the second half of that century, I get the same thing. Okay? If I do it for the pre-1756 period, I get something very different. Okay? I begin to get evidence of slaves for guns. Okay? So, possible dynamic is that in that early period, there is some slaves for guns going on. In the later period, not. And this is my hypothesis. I present a little bit of evidence that this is going on. In the first half of the century, there's an arms race. It's sort of like an offensive defense. Raid or be raided. Prisoner's dilemma. There's some great quotes that you can find in the literature on that. You better go out, even if you're not interested in slavery, you better go out and get some so that you can get guns and protect yourself. Okay? And then in the later period, there's guns for slaves after the new technology has sort of shocked the region out of its previous political equilibrium, and some are winning and some are losing. Right? Then you upset the balance of power, and there's transition, there's warring to establish a new balance of power. Once that's established, then the Europeans are coming in and entering into treaties with established political powers in Africa. And both parties there have an interest in controlling access to guns. So you get a stabilization of a violent production process where slave production doesn't interfere with the slave trade. The Europeans are always concerned about that. Okay? And here's a quote to that effect. Here's the evidence I can show you. This is a time series of total slave exports, slave trade, all of Africa. Okay? 1640, 1807. Moves around. I then fit a 6-degree polynomial line to it that could move around 6 times, like this, if it had to. Okay? Doesn't have to, it's pretty straight. Charlie Brown says it's straighter than anything I could draw. Okay? Here it is for regions. Here it is for regions. Pretty flat, something happens, boom, takes off. Here it is for another region. Same thing, Gold Coast. Not straight. It's not like it gradually grows. It's not like the slave trade gradually expands. Boom, there's a disequilibrium, and it looks like it establishes a new equilibrium later on. Now, I can tell you this story. This is clearly Ashanti. Okay? That's clearly Ashanti. Here's the Bight of Benin. I can tell you this story. This is clearly Dahomey and Oyo, and there's a lot of history on that.
And then the sloping towards the end of the period is due to change in British law?
No, the ending here is the change in British law.
Yeah.
Why this slopes down here, there are African experts in the room on this. They would probably tell you something. What happens around 1760? I don't know, maybe Oyo starts to weaken, something like that. But ultimately, I want to tell that story. These are the graphs I want to use to tell the political story. Here's the Bight of Biafra. Here's the Windward Coast. Here's Sierra Leone. Okay, my point is it's not a gradual increase. Some of it's slave price, some of it's gunpowder, and then we could get back to this. But that's what that's the empirical evidence that I have for you. We can interpret this up clearly. This is wrong. Okay? It was Africa engaged down here. Clearly, I think Gates sort of borders on racism because he's lumping all Africans in that as if they were all the ones who traded slaves. They weren't. The elites were capturing others. It's like Africans were the worst sufferers of the slave trade, if you class distinguish them. Okay? This strange career of agency where the historians are sort of saying, Africans were controlling a lot. I'm thinking of Eltis and Thornton. And Thornton and I are co-authors, but we just disagree on this. It was the structure. It's that prisoner's dilemma. It's that raid or be raided sort of structure that everybody was put into. Locke's justification is clearly wrong. It's not that the slaves pre-existed and the Europeans were trading them. They were producing them. And the abolitionists made a point of that. Locke was dead by then, I think. And then the zero marginal cost, again, not true. There were increasing costs. That supply curve was positive. Okay, it's not like this was some kind of surplus population dumped on the market. It was produced. Orlando Patterson's social death is clearly a very wide-ranging process. Okay, and then this we've already looked at.
So a very engaging talk. So we have only 5 minutes. That's okay. That was wonderful. So questions? Very few.
When I looked at the data, just by inspection, not by analysis, obviously, are there some parts of Western Africa that fed mainly to England and others mainly to the U.S.?
Yes. Oh, others to the U.S.?
Yeah.
No, slaves didn't go to England. There was no slavery in England.
As-
Oh.
Prior to what?
I mean, there were a few slaves that went back, but most of the vast majority went to the West Indies, and only a small percentage to the United States, but mainly to Jamaica and Barbados.
One other quick question. There's no mention of the loss of slaves during the Great Voyage.
Right.
What effect did that have?
On this, not much. On what I'm doing here, not much, because I'm looking at Africa. I want to know what Africans are getting from this, and how this demand, this international demand for enslaved Africa, I don't see any demand for African indentures. So I call it international demand for enslaved Africans. How that influenced Africa. Okay, so Africa is reallocating resources to capture people, changing state structure and all, and then they're selling it on the coast. What happens after that is not their concern. That feeds into the profitability calculations of the slavers in England and the prices that are charged in the New World. It's the cost of doing business, but it has no influence at all on what I'm looking at here. Yes?
Yeah, so very interesting, and I think it seems very plausible what you're arguing. I worked actually in East Africa, so in areas where you don't have hardly any slave trade historically. And I'm just wondering especially about this ethnic fractionalization argument, because you also have high ethnic fractionalization there. You don't have the development of states. In fact, West Africa has much more development of states historically than most of East Africa. So I wonder whether, that matters for this argument, or maybe just different dynamics could have been going on in each place to create the same sort of outcome. But it's maybe the argument that what we see today in terms of ethnic fractionalization and trust, you'd have to have a different story, I guess.
What Nathan Nunn did was he aggregated all of the slave trades together. So he got estimates from Ralph Austin and on the Trans-Saharan, on the Indian Ocean trade, all of that affects East Africa over a much longer period of time. Okay, so the numbers, you could be seeing something. You could be seeing something that's a longer term process, but generating the same outcomes there. I think not. I mean, and we haven't done that yet. We need to replicate this analysis on the east coast of Africa. We didn't. Those 200 points, those circles were all on the west coast of Africa because we have good transatlantic slave trade data numbers. We have some transatlantic slave trade happening on the east coast of Africa after 1807. A lot of the ships went over right into that.
Yeah,
so we could look and see if in the 19th century we get any of that effect on the east coast of Africa. But I don't think that fully addresses your question. We just had a seminar conference at Michigan on, this was the second in a series of 3 Mellon conferences on ethnicity in Africa. And this one was on the Yoruba. And we had a whole bunch of scholars there talking about how this was an Atlantic issue involving Brazil, missionaries back to Africa, and the whole bit. At the end of that conference, the East Africanists said exactly what you said. We would not even have this conversation, in East Africa. So what's the difference? What's going on? I think there's clearly a difference. We haven't sorted it out yet, but I think there is.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk.